book review for which I don't have the physical copy of the book. It's another book of literary criticism by maybe one of the best English literary critics of the 20th century. He passed away a few years ago in 2010. His name is Frank Kermode, Welsh literary critic. And he wrote this book in the 70s called The Genesis of Secrecy on the Interpretation of Narrative. And this book is actually a set of collected and expanded Charles Eliot Norton lectures that he gave at Harvard during the year 1977-78. In this book, Kermode announces his task to be one of a secular interpreter, or an anti-interpreter, as it might be called, completely unencumbered yet still highly knowledgeable of older biblical critical traditions and their associated dogmas. Hermeneutics is his main concern here. That is the art and practice of literary interpretation. The Gospel of Mark is the real center of gravity for him, but Kermode's Catholicity draws him also to James Joyce and Henry Green, with some non-canonical Gospels thrown in for good measure. In his first lecture, which is called Carnal and Spiritual Senses, the act of interpretation is likened to an attempt to transition from being an outsider to an insider. That is, someone with special, institutionalized knowledge about the text at hand. Interpretation is necessarily an act that always frustrates itself if it aims to find a concrete, absolute nugget of meaning. Instead, the multiplicity and indeterminacy of hermeneutic practice and our proclivity for allegorical and elliptical readings mean that any essentialism or any real transcendent truth is textually impossible, he argues. In fact, Kermode all but says that what it means to be a narrative is to have a hermeneutic potential. That is, to be a narrative is to be able to be interpreted. His carnal and spiritual here are sort of reconfigurations of Freud's manifest and latent, but without all the Freudian baggage. With biblical texts, he sometimes opts for the familiar pleromatist or pleromatist instead of the word latent. In another lecture called What Are the Facts, he discusses the role of textual facticity in historical writing. This is especially controversial considering that Kermode has chosen the Gospels as a main focus, texts where historical facts are hard to square, to say the least. To add to the complexity of looking at the Gospels as historical documents, one must consider that the Passion narrative was foretold in the Old Testament, and therefore its authenticity was a prerequisite to the supposed authority of the Gospels. In short, Kermode makes the dubious claim that as a textual outsider, it's well nigh impossible to discern historical writing from any other type of writing. It's uncertain whether Kermode here knew exactly how close he is to post-structuralism, which was just sort of getting off of its feet. I don't remember the exact year when Lyotard wrote his introductory text on post-structuralism, or I think it was in the early 80s. So I think he's before Lyotard here. Correct me if I'm wrong. It's not the case that all narratives dissolve into an incoherent semiological play of signs and signifiers when under interpretive scrutiny. Kermode's approach results in a kind of textual nihilism, in a sense. Interpretation always involves the interplay of intentionality and historical perspective, but there is no reason why that interplay must necessarily annihilate our ability to discern between genres, or what those genres are trying to accomplish. Kermode also never discusses his controversial choice of texts he uses to reach his conclusions. What would have happened had he chosen Sallust or, say, another ancient historian whose accounts can be checked against other texts and archaeological evidence. The choice of the Gospel of Mark makes Kermode's arguments no less fascinating or thought-provoking, but it does make arguing the point much easier. Since this is one of the best-known books of Kermode's latter work and is indicative of a marked turn away from some of his earlier work, especially his 1957's The Romantic Image, which was a more traditional piece of criticism. In this earlier book, he accuses historians of applying some, quote, false categories of modern thought, rendering their work little more than myth or allegory. Many of Kermode's attacks in The Romantic Image were driven by a call for a correspondence theory of truth between all kinds of texts, historical, critical, and literary. Unfortunately, the genesis of Secrecy took a turn away from his earlier attempts at genre criticism and toward what Kermode has elsewhere called French utopianism. This is a wonderful and interesting little book, and one that everyone interested in modern literary criticism should certainly be exposed to. I happen to disagree with its conclusion, but I found that it made me wrestle with some of the more fundamental assumptions I had about criticism as an act. Even considering the significant change in approach in the 20 years separating The Romantic Image and the genesis of Secrecy, Kermode never lost any of his scholarly cosmopolitanism and humane warmth, which is what draws me in to read him again and again. He really was a great critic.